Hey everyone, welcome back to the Behavioral Observations podcast. In session 309, we're diving into a really important and sometimes overlooked topic, the intersection of applied behavior analysis, autism, and law enforcement. My guest today is Dr. Lyndsy Cofield, the Director of Client Success at Apollo Behavior. Lyndsy has an incredible story of how she got started in ABA, beginning with a degree in speech pathology from my alma mater, the University of New Hampshire, and how she worked as an RPD. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Behavioral Observations podcast. In session 309, we are diving into a really important and sometimes overlooked topic, the intersection of autism and law enforcement personnel. My guest today is Dr. Lyndsy Cofield, the Director of Client Success at Apollo Behavior. Lyndsy has an incredible story of how she got started in ABA, beginning with getting her degree in speech pathology from my alma mater, the University of New Hampshire, and then how she found her way into applied behavior analysis, first working as an RPT, getting her BCBA, and eventually earning her PhD. But what really stood out to me in our conversation is her work in training police officers to better understand and support individuals with autism. Lyndsy's research looks at how officers interpret or possibly misinterpret the behavior of individuals with autism, the role of body cam footage in training, and practical strategies to prevent dangerous misunderstandings. In this episode, we talk about her experiences going through a citizens police academy, the challenges of teaching within law enforcement culture, and real-life stories of how de-escalation training is making a difference. As a content warning, I do want to let you know we do talk about crime and some crime statistics and even things like suicide. So again, I just want to provide a content warning for those who might be sensitive to that. That aside, whether you're an ABA professional, a parent, or just someone who cares about how our communities can better support autistic individuals, I think you'll find this conversation both eye-opening and inspiring. Before we get to the interview, I want to let you know that we're brought to you by the following sponsors. Frontera. Consider taking a demo of Frontera's assessment builder and see how the ethical application of AI technologies can help you serve clients and save you time. Your first assessment report is free, and if you use the code BOP25, you'll get an additional 5 assessments for just $100. So head to fronterahealth.com to check it out. We're brought to you by HRIC Recruiting. Yep, we talk about Barb Voss and actually Lyndsy's interactions with Barb and how Barb helped her find her way to Apollo. So if you're looking for a job, if you're about to graduate, if you're moving, or if you just want to know if the grass is greener on the other side, go to hricolorado.com or check the show notes for this episode for a link. We're brought to you by CEUs from Behavioral Observations. That's right, yours truly. Learn from your favorite podcast guests while you're commuting, walking the dog, or whatever else you do while listening to the podcast. I've added a bunch of new events and more are on the way. So go to behavioralobservations.com/getCEUs to learn more. Last but not least, we're brought to you by the Behavioral Toolbox. Check out our courses for school-based and other behavioral professionals, including our newest one, Motivational Interviewing, Getting Educator Buy-In. All right, that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun conversation with Dr. Lyndsy Cofield.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Lyndsy Cofield, thanks for coming back on the Behavioral Observations podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm pumped to be back here. I have a lot of updates to give you.
All right. We will get into those shortly. And we have a great topic, a very important topic of, how to improve interactions between law enforcement communities and individuals with autism. Super important topic. Really looking forward to getting into it. But before we do that, though, I'd like the audience to get to know you better in case they might have missed that Apollo episode we did a few years ago. It has been a little bit. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you fell into this ABA world? Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, sure. I fell into the ABA world similar to how I hear others falling into the ABA world. I had an undergrad in speech pathology, and I went to go get my master's. I had been attending the University of New Hampshire And I was a little bit disheartened after I graduated. I had a really hard time getting into a master's program in speech pathology. And so in the meantime, I decided to kind of stick to some of the roots of what I had been doing throughout my undergraduate degree, which was working with young individuals with autism. And so I decided to go the RBT route, and I figured I'll do that for a year and then I'll get right back into speech pathology, and here we are 13, 14 years later. And I'm now a BCBA and kind of fell into it that way. So got into working at first in a clinic and then eventually into home services with a little bit of residential somewhere in the middle there. So I've kind of been around different settings, different environments, and I landed myself back in a clinic now. So I'm
I
happy
see.
to, yeah.
Well, it's great to hear from a fellow UNH alumni, although
Yes.
I was in the psych department, not in the
Speech.
speech
Yeah.
path. So I had to learn all that stuff kind of on the job, the important aspects of, or at least the parts of speech therapy that overlaps with behavior analysis. So I'm sure
Yeah.
your undergrad training probably gave you a lot of insight that perhaps many of us don't have. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So you are, so you were in the, New England area. And so how did you find your way to Apollo?
Yeah. All the way in Georgia. Well, initially, I was working for an in-home service provider in Boston. I lived in Dorchester for 10 years. I loved, the time I had in Boston, but it was just getting to a point more so in my personal life where I was just kind of looking for a bit of a change, and I didn't really know what that change was. So on a whim, I had heard of BCBA recruiters and I had heard of Barbara Voss, who is a fantastic BCBA recruiter. And I reached out to her. And I remember reaching out to her, like I was sitting in a gas station and I was just thinking, this probably isn't going to go anywhere. I'm sure she's super busy. And she got back to me and she said, "Hey, I know that you don't totally know where you want to move or what direction you want to go in just yet, but there is this company down in Georgia and they're beginning to open clinics there and they're, a nice startup company. Would you be interested in meeting with them?" And at first I was thinking, Georgia, I've never even been to Georgia. I think I had been to Savannah on a bachelorette trip or something like that, but I had never been to Atlanta. And she said, they're a really great small company. I think you would enjoy meeting with them. So sure enough, I flew down and really just fell in love with the company and what they were doing, here, opening clinics in Georgia. And it was scary at first. I'm not going to lie. It's scary to move, your whole life. And you really want to make sure that in that short amount of time, that little weekend that I was there, that this was a company that I could really see myself working for. And there's only so much you get to see during that interview process. You're really seeing the best of the best, right? They're also kind of selling what they can give you. You're selling what you can give them and so on. So it was nerve-wracking at first. And, you know, I'm thrilled to say it's been almost 4 years since then. And Apollo has just been the best blessing that I've had. Not only have they relocated me to the South, which, I didn't know I was meant to be in the South, but I feel at home here. I met my husband here. So now I am in the South for the foreseeable future. We're expecting a baby boy in January. So
Oh, yay.
yeah, that's really exciting. And so none of that would have happened, honestly, if not Apollo hadn't brought me down to Georgia. And so just really great things that have gone on since moving down here. So
Wow, that's a cool story.
yeah.
And I can appreciate I guess the challenge of, kind of, or the rolling of the dice, as it were, in any type of move like that when you're moving, either to go to graduate school or to take a job or something like that. I've had to do that a couple of times, and yeah, it can be scary, but at the same time, it's great to hear that not just but it worked out, extremely well. And so I appreciate
Yeah.
you giving us those updates. Also, noteworthy is the shout out to Barbara Voss, because she has been one of the longest. She's the longest term sponsor of the behavioral observation.
Wow.
Yeah, behavioral observations. So we're big fans of Barbara and her work here, and your account of your interactions with her is, kind of jives with a lot of the feedback that I get from folks who reach out to her many times on a whim, like you described, and have had
Yeah.
lots of positive results. So yeah, that's super cool. And yeah, no, I always say that nobody knows the ABA field better than at least the employment aspects of it better than Barbara does, because she puts people in positions all over the country. And so anyway,
Yeah.
good stuff. Good stuff. All right. So I appreciate those updates. And so what are you doing now? What is your role at Apollo these days?
Yeah. So last time you met me, I was a clinical director at our flagship location in Johns Creek, Georgia. Since then, I want to say back then, we might have had 3 or 4 clinics. We just opened our 11th clinic. So we have really grown around the Georgia area. I was promoted to senior clinical director probably shortly after we spoke last. And now I'm working as the director of client success, which is essentially overseeing our intake department. And this has been a really cool and unique role that Apollo has offered me. Essentially, what I'm doing is not only overseeing the intake of the clients that are coming in, but also dabbling a little bit in our marketing as well and trying to figure out how we can gauge interest from people. We are becoming more of a saturated market in Georgia, so learning how to kind of make sure that we're really expressing to people that we are the best of the best and that we offer high quality services, not just services. And so it's been a really interesting position. It's challenged a very different part of my brain to kind of come out of the clinical realm and doing less direct service behavior plans and those sort of things, and now kind of looking at the marketing side of things a little bit more. So it's been an interesting but really rewarding switch.
Yeah. Sounds like there are different aspects of the job that are, mentally stimulating in various ways.
Yeah.
So that's really cool that they put this role together for you, and that you're, finding some success there.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You made the comment about market saturation. It's just kind of almost odd to hear that that's the case in some communities, because in so many others, there's, wait lists that are, that go on and on and
I
on.
know.
So I guess the good news with that, I suppose, or at least with the community that you guys practice in, is that, it seems like if people need services, they can access it one way or the other.
Yeah.
Hopefully with you guys, but at least access services regardless. So that's good news. Are you at BCBA feeling overwhelmed by the time and energy it takes to complete intake assessments for kids with autism? You're not alone. When hours are spent on paperwork instead of providing care, it slows everything down for you and the families counting on you. That's why Frontera exists. Frontera is an AI-driven, HIPAA-compliant platform designed specifically for ABA professionals like you. Built by Amal Deshpande, a seasoned founder and father to a child with autism, Frontera brings together clinicians and engineers to streamline the most time-consuming parts of your job. So what does that actually look like? With Frontera's smart tools like the Assessment Builder and Diagnosis Builder, you can reduce your report writing workload from 8 to 10 hours to just 3 to 4. That's more time for therapy, faster access to services, and less burnout. Visit fronterahealth.com to see how it works. Use code BOP25 at checkout to get 15% off both of our report writing tools. Let Frontera help you work smarter so you can focus on what matters most. So I want to transition into something, the main topic here, now that we've got a kind of a better background and the audience has a better feel in terms of your perspective and so forth. So you've done a lot of work with law enforcement agencies, police departments, et cetera. And I want to kind of do a deep dive into that. But I guess my first question, I always start with kind of like how and why questions, so like, we'll start with the how, I suppose. So like, how did you come in contact with this total, what we might consider like a totally separate, occupational area or institution or whatever you want to call it. So what made you want to work with law enforcement agencies? And we'll talk about what work you do shortly, but what was the motivation to do that in the first place?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. They're like, how did you end up connecting in the police realm? So I was actually taking a firearm safety class, and I took the class, and it was run by a state trooper in Massachusetts. And after the class, I remember approaching him, and mind you, this was 14 years ago. And I know this comment's going to upset a lot of people, but 14 years ago, I said, hey, what can we do? I work with individuals with autism. At the time, I was a behavior technician. And I said, what training do you get in terms of autism awareness? And I was just kind of curious, making conversation with him after the class. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, oh, we don't have time for that.
Mm.
And it just sat in my stomach funny. And to this day, I'll never forget it. And I'll never forget how he said it. And I went back to work, and I just kept thinking there's got to be something that can be done here. And, as I went through my master's program, and eventually I was faced with the choice of what is my dissertation topic going to be in my PhD program. And one of my professors had said, there's two rules for your PhD. One is make it the most narrow topic you possibly can. Make
Advice, yeah.
sure that question is as specific as possible, because it's so easy to get carried away with your dissertation where you're like, okay, what about this? And what about this?
And then you never finish.
And then you never finish. He often said to me, B equals PhD. It's like, stop being a perfectionist, just get it done. But his second rule was make sure you pick a topic that you're not going to get sick of. And so I had two topics of interest. One was law enforcement and one was prompting hierarchies. And after spending 3 years in the law enforcement realm, I'm so glad I didn't choose prompting hierarchies because I think that might have gotten a little bit dry, even though that still does really interest me. But he said, you can do research on that later. Just, keep yourself engaged. So I
Those are all
decided,
solid pieces of advice, I might
yeah,
say.
yeah.
Before we get too far down this area, where did you do your graduate training, out of curiosity?
I went to Simmons for my master's, and then I went to Cambridge College for my PhD program. Cambridge College has since merged with Bay Path University in Massachusetts. So their PhD program is now all through Bay Path. But it was a great program and great advisors. I recommend everybody look into Bay Path. It was very rewarding to go there. And I was able to do the majority of my PhD work in Georgia, which was awesome. So,
Yeah, I know some folks who are about to finish their program with them, and they've been able to do their research in their local communities, and then I believe they go up there for like a residency
yes.
of sorts for for like a week, one or 2 weeks a year or something like that for some
Yes.
intense coursework.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, glad that all worked out, and
Yeah.
glad you again found landed in such a with such an amazing company. So all right, so something sat with you that I'm going to kind of return to the story here before I interrupted it.
Yeah.
So you went back to work and something sat with you that didn't feel right. What was it about that? In other words, can you take a minute and maybe describe some of the challenges that, or I'm assuming that the way, because it didn't sit right, there might have been some challenges that you saw in the interaction with the law enforcement communities and autistic communities and things like that. So yeah, set us up with why this is important and why you felt such a need to really delve into this at a very deep level.
Yeah. I think, one of the main viewpoints that I took at first was the view of my brother, who is a federal officer. He's actually a game warden now in Alaska, he lives a very adventurous life. He sends pictures of plane rides to work that he has to take and things like that. But when I originally ran this by him and I ran that interaction by him, what he said was, there's just a lot of bad training out there. And what happens is, someone like you, Lyndsy, you'll go into a police department and, they're just kind of thinking, this girl has never had her life at risk. This girl has never been threatened by an individual with a knife. This girl has never been in our shoes, right? And so there's a lot of misconceptions there that the advice that I may give to a law enforcement department could actually be harmful to a law enforcement officer. So when he gave me that perspective, it kind of clicked a little bit that, in order for me to really be a good instructor, I have to understand and really put myself in the shoes of the individuals who are doing that work. And if you think about, imagine being an RBT or a BCBA and pediatrician comes in and explains to you how to run an ABA session. They're probably going to give you some good advice, right? But let's say they're describing punishment and reinforcement in terms that aren't actually punishment and reinforcement. They're going to lose credibility with you fairly quickly. They're going to say, after they leave, you're going to say, well, that was nice, but that guy really didn't know what he was talking about, or that girl really didn't know what she was talking about, right? And so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to be just another person that was coming in and saying, don't do this, don't do that, until I really had a better understanding of the culture and what it was like to be in their shoes.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. And I think you're touching on police culture more generally, and maybe this I wanted to bring this up at some point or another. And so, can you talk a little bit about I think the mindset, to your point about law enforcement officers do face risks and that civilians don't, and so can you talk to us a little bit about police culture in general, and how some of these attitudes might get fostered, and maybe a little bit about how you set out to learn more about that culture, so you could have the rapport and the gravitas, as it were, to be able to teach with a level of credibility you might not otherwise if you did what you described, and the hypothetical example of the pediatrician. It kind of reminds me of what I think most behavior analysts have experience with this if they don't have kids, but they're talking to a parent about various approaches to childhood behavior. There's always that there's always parents who are like, I don't know, you haven't what it's like to be woken up in the middle of the night 100 times or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, having a stepdaughter has humbled me in ways that I never really understood before. I remember working in homes in Boston and, parents asking me advice about things and me saying, well, just don't give in. Just don't, just withhold. Don't give in, and I remember this one parent to this day, man, she humbled me like no other, but she looked at me one day and I was just talking and talking and talking. She looked at me and she goes, Lyndsy, how many kids do you have?
uh,
And I said, none. And she goes, are you married? Do you have pets? And I was like, no, I live in this 1-bedroom apartment all by myself. And she's like, come back when you have kids. And she's right. You really have to immerse yourself and really understand.
oh, hang on. Please tell me she had like the sickest Boston accent when she said that. I could.
Oh, she scared the crap out of me.
Okay. All right. I can better picture it in my mind than with.
Yeah. No, she was a great mom, but she definitely, she was very sweet until she wasn't, and she scared me quite a bit. But no, I mean it was a good experience, right? And not to get too off topic here, but I think that not only has Liza, my stepdaughter, taught me patience and what it's like to come home to children, right, instead of just working with children, but she's also taught me just about developmental norms as well, where my whole life has been working with children with autism. And I never really got to spend a lot of time around kids. And here I was thinking, oh, I'm a childhood expert. I know all this about children. And, you know, and then, to see she's 7, but when I first met her, she was 5 and she was having tantrums, right? And I'm like, why am I asking this 3-year-old at work to have 0 tantrums? But it's totally age appropriate for my 5-year-old to have a tantrum, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. So that's just been a humbling experience in itself. But, going back to law enforcement, I think one of the best things that I did early on was I really went out of my way to immerse myself in police culture. And, some of my friends would make fun of me. They'd say, why are you listening to this podcast about policing right now? Like they'd get in my car and they'd be like, what in the world are you listening to? And it would be a police training podcast. And it would be about something ridiculous like taser laws or, first aid or using a tourniquet, right? And I get that none of those things on the surface have anything to do with autism, but what I wanted to know was if I go in there and I'm training this population, what kind of language do they use? What are some of the things that they're expected to do in their day-to-day, and things like that. And then I think honestly, the best thing I did was I joined our local Citizens Police Academy. And what that is most departments have these. Any town or any major city should have this. But essentially, it's a civilian course that you can take. It's after work hours. It does not make you a police officer. I know a lot of people say, I don't want to take a Citizens Police Academy class because I don't want to be a cop. It's not that. It's more just kind of immersing you into your community so you can kind of see what's going on within City Hall, within the police department. One week, it was a 911 sit-in where we sat in with the 911 center. So I sat there all night. I stayed overnight. They're like, you can go home now. I'm like, no, I want to keep listening to this. Ride along with the police department, meeting the K-9 unit, meeting the motorcycle and the traffic unit. And that was a really awesome experience to kind of immerse myself in that culture a little bit more, put myself in their shoes.
Meaningful change in schools starts with true buy-in from teachers and leaders. But resistance is real. Overloaded with initiatives, educators often feel unheard and overwhelmed. Our online course, Motivational Interviewing, Getting Educator Buy-in, empowers you to create genuine collaboration. Learn to build trust, align with their values, and inspire lasting commitment, not just compliance. Ready to transform engagement? Enroll now at thebehavioraltoolbox.com.
What were some of the did anything surprise you? Or, I have to imagine you got a completely different view, both literally and figuratively, of your community with the ride-alongs and sitting in the 911 call center. What were those experiences like?
I think the amount of things that happen right under our noses or right around the corner from us that we never even hear about because we're protected from that, right? We don't need to deal with the crime that's happening because the police department deals with the crime. Or we don't hear about, someone having this awful heart attack because the EMTs came and took that person to the hospital. I was shocked. There was one moment where one of the officers had asked me what part of town I lived in. And when I told them the name of my apartment complex, they said, we've actually been called over there for 6 suicides since that building has been opened. And this is a very nice apartment complex. I'm brand new to this area, right? Never in a million years. And I'd been living there for, 6-8 months. I had never seen police presence in my apartment complex. Never in a million years would I have thought that there was a suicide problem in my apartment complex, right? And I think that just goes to show how much is happening around you that we don't always hear or know about. that, I don't know, it just painted a totally different picture of the community I was living in, that, these things could happen. And on the surface, it looks like nice landscaping and everybody's happy and farmers markets on Saturdays and stuff. But behind closed doors, people have a lot going on that, we might not know about. And so that was kind of a startling moment, I think.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, not in a good way. I mean, it's
Yeah.
very tragic statistics. So, are there other? You were kind enough to send me, and I'll link to this in the show notes, the episode you did with the folks at Beyond the Science podcast. There were some other aspects of police culture, I think you were talking about with the guys. Let's see, about like the idea of like, assessing risk,
Yes.
when they arrive on a scene of whatever they're responding to, and, the level of vigilance that they have to maintain walking into these potentially dangerous situations. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yep. So one of the best examples I can give you on this is I was on a ride along. I was actually home in Massachusetts for Christmas, and I went on a ride along in one of the towns that has some of the most crime in Massachusetts. And during that ride along, it was a pretty easy day. It was sunny. It was nice out. We were listening to music on the radio. Everything was kind of relaxed. I remember feeling like this is easy. Like, this is an easy day. There were a couple calls about, maybe some like drug use in the town square that we had to respond to, but it was just kind of like moving people along from sitting on the sidewalk for too long, little things like that. And then at the very end of the shift, we got a well-being check. And it was, for those of you from the North, there's a lot of these like 3-family homes where you have to kind of walk up 3 flights of floor, and there's condo 1, condo 2, condo 3 kind of stacked on top of each other.
Triple deckers.
Triple deckers. Yeah. We don't really have as many of those here. So we get to the scene. We're the first car there. And I remember the female officer saying to me, you don't have to go in, but I can't go in alone. It's completely up to you. And she's like, we can wait for backup or you can come. And, I'm like, I want to be cool. Like, I want to be cool. I want to go. So I was like, no, it's fine. I'll go. And then as soon as I kind of got in through the door, the landlord was really frantic. And she's saying, this keeps happening to me. This keeps happening to me. We can't find this person. No one's seen him in days. I don't know why this keeps happening at my properties. And I'm like, okay, and I'm trying to kind of just like calm her down and, use some of those de-escalation strategies that we use at work. And as we're walking up the stairs are really dark and really narrow. The police officer's in front of me. I'm in the middle and the landlord's behind me. And she starts kind of having like shortness of breath, and she's kind of acting like she's about to pass out. So I kind of get behind her and I tell her to sit down. And she's like, I'm just really worried there's a dead body there. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that did not even really cross my mind at that point. I knew like what a well-being check was, but I was like, holy cow, I'm about to open this door and smell a dead body or see a dead body. Like, this is kind of a lot. So the officer finally gets to the top. And I also just had this moment where I was thinking, is this like an ambush? Because at this point, there's this woman behind us acting faint, and there's no one else here. So I'm in the middle of all of this. And it just kind of stuck out to me. I'm like, this isn't totally a safe situation. Thankfully, the landlord was just feeling faint and she needed to sit down and kind of collect herself. But, eventually the officer had to like get through the door, and we had to search the apartment just to make sure that there was no one deceased in there. And thankfully there wasn't, right? But it was just this kind of like escalation of how do you turn your brain from relaxing and listening to music to that like fight or flight a little bit of what am I going to find? Am I at risk? I'm kind of in the middle. I remember thinking like, this person's behind me, right? And I can't totally see what they're doing. Sometimes in ABA, we worry about clients being behind us, right? It's really good safety just to kind of be aware of your surroundings and not, put yourself below a midline of a client, things like that. But to like really fear that someone could potentially hurt you. I mean, that was one of the first times in my life that I was like, oh my goodness, what is about to happen? And that is nothing. I said that on the other podcast too. That is a very light encounter. That's a light call for that officer, right? The amount of things that they have to see and have to interact with. I mean, I don't know how you turn those things off and then you go home to a 7-year-old who's like, Lyndsy, how was your day at work today? Tell me what happened, right? I don't know. That just really kind of that stuck with me.
Did you and the officer that you were responding with have a chance to talk about that encounter or debrief in any way?
We got called right to another call.
Okay.
It happens so fast, right? And then it's like, then we got called to a domestic where the officer actually said, I don't feel safe with you getting out of the car with this one because there's a very escalated woman. There's reports of weapons in the house, right? So then I just had to sit in the car and just kind of process what I had just encountered. And I think that that's actually pretty normal where there isn't a ton of time to process what you just saw or kind of talk through it. It's just kind of like one thing after another.
Wow. So you have repeated exposure to these alerting or excitatory events, I suppose, and that probably doesn't do wonders for the nervous system.
No, I can't imagine it does.
Okay.
No.
Well, I appreciate you giving us that insight into a world that most of us are completely unaware of. Let's talk a little bit about your specific work, though, with these departments. In general, what are the types of topics that you discuss when you're doing these trainings? What is your
Yeah.
goal when you if you have an opportunity to lead a training or give a lecture or lead a workshop or something like that? What are you trying to convey, or what are some of the things you generally talk about?
Yeah. I think, one of the best pieces of advice that I think I give is just to, when you have time, to slow down a little bit and just kind of assess what is actually going on. I think it's fairly often that I hear that individuals that these law enforcement officers are coming across, they might exhibit behaviors that are sometimes misinterpreted as suspicious or non-compliant and not even really considering autism, avoiding eye contact, repeating phrases, not responding to verbal commands, right? Stimming. Stimming is a big one that is often confused with drug use. And stimming with, I've seen body cam of an incident, I believe it was actually in Georgia or Florida, where an individual had a spoon, a really long spoon, and it was dark. And at night with the car light, it sure looked like a knife, and this individual is just stimming on this spoon. And, I can look at the video and be like, okay, he's stimming on a spoon. But if you've never seen that before, right, what else are you to think when you're approaching and you're saying, drop the weapon, and no one is responding, right? Now, is that individual approaching you? Yes or no? If yes, there might not be time to stop and assess, right? Then it might be a situation where this person's approaching me with what looks like a weapon. I have to make a call for my own safety. If they're not approaching you, though, is it possible to kind of assess that situation and say, hey, does this individual have a weapon? Why are they not responding to me? And also getting some backup in there to kind of slow that situation down a little bit, right? But without proper training and without just awareness, right? I mean, that's the biggest thing, is just bringing some sense of awareness to what you can expect an individual with autism to engage in, what types of behaviors to engage in, and also just how to better communicate as well.
So if I can just maybe summarize here, so I make sure I understand you. So if an officer arrives on the scene, perhaps there's a call for, that there's an individual who is experiencing some unusual behavior. Obviously, they're not wearing a T-shirt that says "I have autism," and so upon arrival, the officer has to very quickly figure out what's going on. That's got to be a really difficult thing to process. especially if it's a situation that has the potential to be dangerous. And
Mhm.
to your point, they have to make some sort of decision with seemingly imperfect information. And I also resonate with your point about, in terms of not being able to respond to verbal instructions. Yeah, I was pulled over the other day, and I hadn't been pulled over in years. And fortunately, I got a warning, just a verbal warning. I was going a little over the speed limit. But it just reminded I hadn't had an interaction with a police officer in quite some time, and sometimes I'll look at these things through a behavior analytic lens, and it's like, okay, there was a series of instructions, and that have to be followed in order for the encounter to be resolved successfully.
Yeah.
So certainly following directions, following instructions, responding to those types of things, or the lack thereof, can kind of make or break a situation. And so if you have a population of individuals who are who struggle with that sort of thing, there's a real potential for misunderstandings up all the way up through tragic outcomes. So
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, so you provide kind of like an overview of the characteristics of autism and how that might relate to their interactions with with autistic individuals in the community. Are and that sounds awesome. Are there other aspects that you've learned that are challenging and that you've developed trainings on of these
Yeah.
sorts of things?
So definitely characterizing, some of the behaviors that one might see, but also explaining that autism is a spectrum, right? And so just because someone can speak does not mean that they might not have autism, right? And vice versa. So not just the characteristics, but also how to have a successful interaction with an individual with autism, where you might consider giving a little bit more time to respond to something, right? If you ask a question, really counting in your head to 5 to 10 seconds before you're just repeating that question over and over, not expecting eye contact all the time, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that that person is suspicious, but it might just not be a preferred thing for that individual to do. Maintaining a good distance from that individual where you're not, right next to that person, giving them the space that they need. And also just like asking, right? It's okay to ask an individual like, "Hey, do you have autism? Is there something I can do to help you? Can I turn off these lights for you that are flashing in the back?" I think some departments have implemented some great resources for this. I believe Massachusetts has the Blue Letter Project now, or the Blue Envelope Project. And this is a blue envelope that an individual with autism can keep in their dashboard. And what it is basically just kind of explaining, I have autism, I might be slower to respond to you, and it's very individualized to that person. So the adult or the caregiver can kind of fill that out. So that way, if they are pulled over, like what you were describing, and you're already kind of nervous,
Hmm.
that kind of signals to the officer, like, hey, this isn't a suspicious individual. This is just someone who is wildly uncomfortable with this encounter and just needs a second to kind of process what I'm saying and, things like that. So we're making progress. I think the other big part of the training that I like to go over is just how to better interact with your community, just to make sure that you can avoid these situations before they even happen. So one big thing is just, having community events where you can kind of get to know the individuals in your community that may or may not have autism. We want to practice these really challenging situations before they even happen. So, for example, getting pulled over, if this is an individual with autism who just became a new driver, we might practice that pullover several times. And that takes the community, right? That takes police in the community to say, hey, let's run this practice session. So that way we can teach people how to respond in these, I call them like red zone situations. We're already all so escalated, right? In a situation like that, let's practice them when we're not in the red zone. Let's
Yeah,
practice that beforehand.
that makes all the sense in the world. And yeah, we there was a New Hampshire ABA conference a few years ago where one of the speakers they were doing something along these lines. They were giving a talk similar to yours, and they invited a police officer from Salem, New Hampshire, to speak at the conference. And here's a guy. This guy looked like, I mean, he came in and he was in uniform and he had all the, he had all the gear on. He looked like he was ready to go into like, like storm a compound or something like that. And he had like this, this big beard and a big burly guy, and the juxtaposition of like the stories he was telling about approaching situations calmly and de-escalating people, and having patience, being compassionate with people's circumstances and things like that. It was quite the juxtaposition. But it's like, wow, this guy either came to this naturally or has had some really solid training. And so if I recall correctly, I might not have this exactly down, but I believe he was he was the autism specialist of the department, I suppose, or, I think that, or he was the guru within the department in terms of how to improve these types of, potential encounters. But that whole idea about, practicing getting pulled over, that's incredible. And I think too, going way back to your earlier story about that Mass Day trooper who said they didn't have time for that. It's great to hear that people are allocating time time to these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
All right, this is good that you're getting out there and doing this type of work, and others are as well. This awareness is improving. Certainly, lots of work to be done. I've got a couple more questions while I have you, Lyndsy, but I want, if there's anything else about the trainings that you do or have done in this, I want to give you the opportunity to share that. Otherwise, I've got just a couple of questions left.
Yeah. Go ahead, ask away.
Okay. All right. So, I think I'd be, remiss if, we didn't touch on some of these more, kind of these encounters that sometimes end in tragedy. And, every couple of months, unfortunately, you see in the news that there's some sort of encounter that ends in an individual's death or serious injury or something like that. I'm imagining, given your interest and specialty in this area, that you've looked at these situations pretty closely. With these events, are there any commonalities or through lines that you've observed? Are there big picture themes that people should be aware of, that, oh my gosh, if they only knew X, then this might not have happened, or something like that?
Yeah. I think it's a sensitive topic, because it's hard for me to sit here and say that something so traumatic and awful was due to a breakdown in communication, or due to, like, I would never want to say like, oh, this was due to like a caregiver's oversight, or due to lack of training on the police department in that area, because every situation is completely different. I do recall, and people send me body cam often, my whole dissertation was on body cam, because I really believe that the use of body cam as a training tool can be really powerful when you're actually watching something back from the viewpoint of the officer, for many different reasons. We have, at the police department that I volunteer at, any individual can come in and say, I want to review the body cam that I was on. I don't feel like that officer treated me well. I want to watch the scenario back. And it's part of just being transparent with your community. But what ends up happening more often than not is the individual will say, I didn't remember it that way. Like that, I was so escalated in that moment that I don't even remember that happening. And so a lot of times watching that body camera back can be really beneficial as a training tool. Unfortunately, it doesn't fix what just happened, right? But just from watching, hundreds of hours of body cam for my dissertation, which, I mean, you can't unsee some of the stuff that you see there either. But just watching that, what I've learned is a lot of times the common themes are, one, there was a communication breakdown somewhere along the way. I watched a recent one. I can't remember if it was Idaho or Iowa, but the individual did have a knife, and unfortunately was actually actively trying to harm others with that knife. And never once in the 911 transcript, when the officers arrived on scene, did anybody say this individual has autism. Never once was that communicated, right? And that's not always the case. I'm sure there's been plenty of incidents where people are shouting, he has autism, she has autism, and the police are, head down doing their job and potentially making mistakes, right? But I think that communication and, again, trying to address these things before they even happen are huge indicators of getting out of a situation like this safer. Another big thing is having a plan in terms of if you have an individual with autism that is under your care and they are frequently getting out of the house, they're frequently stimming with items that look like weapons, that is a great time to be working with your BCBA or even just your neighbors. I mean, letting people around you know, hey, my adult son has autism. If you see him out of the house, he should not be out of the house by himself, right? You need to call me if you see that. Here's a picture of him. Bringing that adult son to the police department, letting them have contact with him as well. I just had a parent tell me a story recently. Their adult son, I believe he's 17 or 18, he's about 6'5", and his favorite thing to do is walk his neighborhood. And he will walk his neighborhood for hours. And they had just moved into the community, and the parents said the first thing we did was we brought him down to the police department and we said, listen, he's 17 or 18. He wants to walk the neighborhood on his own. We trust his ability to do that. But we also know that people are probably going to report him with how often he's walking around the neighborhood. And so the police department brought him in. They gave him some pointers on what to do if, somebody ever did approach him and said, what are you doing out here or whatnot. But there was just more communication. And, I'm not saying that parents are obligated to do that, but it certainly helps. Like the more information that a department has, the more likely they are to kind of understand what's going on. And I think that's fair. But it's on the community to communicate. It's on the police department to communicate. It really has to be a joint effort.
Let's be honest, most CEU events could use a little more sun and a lot more fun. That's why ABA Con at Sea was imagined, a CEU cruise conference for BCBAs who want more from their continuing education than fluorescent lights and cold coffee. From February 16th through 20th, 2026, we're hitting the high seas aboard Royal Caribbean's Wonder of the Seas, with stops in tropical Nassau and Coco Cay. Earn up to 12 CEUs, including ethics and supervision credits, and join sessions led by expert presenters on topics like travel accessibility, habit formation, leadership skills, executive functioning, and more. This isn't your typical CEU event. It's your professional development gateway. Sign up and book your cabin now at goabacon.com. Come join the adventure. That's goabacon.com. We'll see you there. I want to go back to your dissertation, though. So what was what aspect of the body cam footage that did you study for the, what was your dissertation about, I guess, in broad strokes?
So I was just trying to decipher. I was actually using a little bit of BST, and I was using body cam as the model. So rather than me modeling some of the behaviors, I truly felt like it would be better received if officers were to watch other law enforcement officers engage in some of the behaviors. So there were 10 different body cam videos that I used, and throughout those videos, I broke down 6 different behaviors that an officer should engage in to have a successful encounter with an individual with autism. Some were, approaching but giving enough distance, asking questions and then waiting before you're repeating that question over and over, giving that processing time. And I compared lecture only to BST. So the lecture only did have the body cam in it, but it didn't have that model rehearsal component to it. And my results, honestly, were kind of controversial. My results actually showed that both lecture and BST were just as effective. And that could be for a multitude of reasons. It could be because officers typically sit in a roll call that's about a 10-minute lecture every single shift. So maybe they learn well, with just a quick lecture. But I think it actually goes to show that, like, you don't necessarily have to put somebody through an 8-hour training for them to really grasp some of the basic concepts of this. And so, yeah, I think using the body cam, though, is a great tool to kind of improve for the future, how we could be responding to these
I see.
situations.
Did you end up publishing that, or are you considering trying to get it published? Or I always hesitate to ask people about that with dissertations, because I know so many people. I've actually met folks that's like, who've published their dissertation, but like 15 years after they're out of graduate school or something like that. But
I think
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, you're good. I mean, it's on PubQuest, I believe. It is out there. If you Google it, you can find it. But I don't know that I would actually put it through a peer-reviewed process, just because there were so many limitations to it. In fact, the limitation section was the easiest section for me to write. I was like, this is what I messed up on. So I think if I were to publish it, I would need to do another trial run of it. Another group of participants. And I've been so focused on having a family, and definitely not until after the baby comes, but we'll see. It's not out of the question. So
okay, all right, very good, very good. If you send me a link to that, I'll make sure that the dissertation link is in the show notes of this episode as well.
Great.
Wow, this is really fascinating topic, and so important, in some cases potentially life-saving. So I'm really glad you put in the effort to really understand the challenges, and really come to the table with solutions, and not just oh man, I wish this wasn't this way. So
yeah,
thanks for doing that. And I know I usually close out with these interviews with advice for the newly minted BCBA, and I know you also gave some advice about people who might be interested in this work. Do you have any other thoughts? If there are people in the audience like, this is a problem in my community and I really want to do something about it, how would you advise them?
I think that the more the merrier. This is one of those topics that there can never be too many people helping. But I do think if you are interested in training any sort of law enforcement group, definitely do your research, do a ride along, right? They're simple. You can go for a day. I did an overnight shift. I don't know that I would recommend that for your first time, but go for a ride along. And also you might want to consider getting your course post-certified. So post-certified is essentially our equivalent of CEUs. And every police officer has to have a certain amount of CEUs, essentially, for every few years that they're certified as a police officer. And at first, I was going around and doing these trainings just kind of out of the goodness of my heart and wanting, to change this. But eventually what I realized is I was getting a lot of questions of, well, are you post-certified? And, people want to take the class, but they also want to get the credits for it, understandably.
That sounds familiar. I don't know where I've encountered that before, but...
Yeah, exactly. So they were interested at first, but there wasn't enough of a reinforcer there for them. So That's kind of helped a lot too. But, I think don't hesitate to reach out to me either. I'm happy to, I have people ask all the time, like, what can I do to help? And we're going to be doing this far beyond, the day I die. This is going to be a need that we have. And so we just have to keep the more people who are interested, the better. So.
All right. Well, that's helpful information to close with. Dr. Lyndsy Cofield, thank you so much for joining me and educating the audience on this incredibly relevant, important topic.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.